We now are on the second part of our series. So this series entitled Victory Against All Odds. Today we'll look at the life of Joshua. We'll gain some insights from Randy Frazee. When we begin this morning, I want you to remember that our key verse for today comes from Joshua 1:9. It's a verse that I think you may find very helpful throughout your life. If you want to jot it down or mark it in your Bible, it's Joshua 1:9. There it says, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." On June 5th, 1944, General Patton addressed the Third Army the day before the Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. That day he said to them, "I do not want to get any messages saying I'm holding my position. We are not holding. We are advancing constantly, and we are not interested in holding on to anything. Our basic plan of operation is to advance and to keep advancing, regardless of whether we have to go over, under, or through the enemy." The Israelites were facing a similar defeat is not an option challenge. It was finally time for them to enter into that promised land, the land that God said he would give to them over 600 years earlier. It was now time to start the next chapter of God's upper story. Before Moses died, he had appointed Joshua to lead this nation that God was building. 40 years earlier, Joshua was among the 12 spies who went into Canaan to check it out and to report back what they found. When they returned from their mission, they reported that they had good news and they had bad news. The good news was that the land was indeed luscious and flowing with milk and honey. A single cluster of grapes had to be carried by 2 men. Can you imagine that? The bad news was that the people that were living in this land equaled in size to those enormous grapes. The spies described these people as big, scary-looking warriors who made the spies feel like little grasshoppers in comparison to these giants. And those spies recommend that we cannot attack these people. They are much stronger than we are. But only 2 spies disagreed with them. One was Caleb, the other was Joshua. They recommended an immediate attack. But the other spies had already started spreading the doom and gloom news of these frightening people and the impossible tasks that lie ahead of them. All that night, the Israelites grumbled against Moses. And again, they longed for the days when they were slaves back in Egypt. There was even a suggestion of finding a new leader to take them back to Egypt. Joshua tries to change the people's minds. He tells them, "The land we passed through is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land and give it to us. Do not rebel against the Lord. Don't be afraid of the people of the land, because he will devour them. The Lord was with us. Do not be afraid." But the people wouldn't listen. And for being so stubborn, the Israelites got their way, and then some. Not only did they not cross into the promised land then, they had to wander around that wilderness the rest of their lives. Sometimes the best punishment is to give someone exactly what they want. And so an entire generation missed out on the promised land, except for Joshua and Caleb. Now, with Joshua as the new leader, God tells him, get ready. It is now time to enter that land. Not much in Canaan had changed since the spies had entered it 40 years before. The cities were probably a little more fortified, but the people were still big. They were still scary. They were still excellent warriors. 40 years earlier, Joshua was younger, stronger. Now he was older and wiser. He clearly knew what the odds were that they faced as they were going to go against these giants. The first challenge that Joshua faced was managing to mobilize 1 million people to cross a river without any bridges. The second challenge was that God had established that special right of having every male child of Israel circumcised. And he asked that each of these Israelites be circumcised before going into battle. Circumcision was an outward sign of God's covenant with his people. And this whole new generation had missed out on this ritual. Now, not to be indelicate, but performing a circumcision on an adult male is not exactly the best way to prepare for battle. You have to remember, there wasn't any steel scalpels back then. There were only knives made out of flint. Now then, as if this river crossing and the circumcision were not enough, God tells Joshua his whole battle plan for taking care of this walled city of Jericho was to have the Israelites march around the city, blow their trumpets, and shout. God's divine plan was to march and to make noise. Now, to be quite honest, as a leader, I've had to challenge some of the people in the church to do some difficult tasks, and you have always come through. But I don't think I would ever be able to come up here some Sunday morning and say, folks, we are going to go and cross a raging river without any bridges or boats. Now, once we get to the other side, I need all the men to assemble at that big giant tent. Bring your knives and a Band-Aid. And when we finish there, we're going to form a large column and parade around the walled fortress where soldiers are waiting in ambush for us. Don't bring any weapons. Everyone will listen as for the trumpets, and when I give the signal, we're all going to make some noise. That should take care of it. Who's with me? Nobody. From our lower perspective story, this seems impossible, if not silly. God's chosen nation had waited over 600 years to enter this land. They missed out on the opportunity 40 years earlier because of their fear and because of their stubbornness. After years of wandering, God is giving this new generation the opportunity to claim that promised land. Nothing in God's plan made any sense. In our lower story view, nothing seldom does. God's ways are not always our ways, because God always has his upper story plan in view. God knew exactly what he was asking Joshua to do. He encouraged Joshua by repeating these words 3 times to him. He said, be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. He added to that, do not be afraid. This encouragement is a major theme in God's upper story. We know this because we find a variation of that phrase, do not be afraid, appearing more than 100 times throughout the Bible. This community that God is building will not be characterized by fear, even though they may face many fearful moments. God also reminds Joshua to obey all the laws that Moses had passed down. Do not turn from it so that you may be successful wherever you go. Meditate on it day and night. The law was given to the Israelites so that they would get along with one another and to be the community that God could inhabit. God reassures Joshua that he will be with him. The key to victory is not in superior weapons, but it is in obedience. God says, do not be afraid. Trust me. Do exactly what I ask you to do. Live according to the guidelines that I give you, and you will defeat anyone who stands in your way. And you know what? It worked. Joshua did exactly as God said. When Joshua tells his officers about God's plan, their response to him was, whatever you have commanded us, we will do. And wherever you send us, we will go. Led by the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, they approached the Jordan River. As soon as the priests' feet touched the water, God stops the flow so that the entire nation can cross on dry land into the promised land. Then they obey by circumcising every male before they begin their march around Jericho. On the seventh day, they circle the city 7 times before they blow the trumpets, and the people all shout, and the walls all came tumbling down. In the rest of Joshua's story, we hear of the conquest of this land. In the south, they defeat 5 kings in their combined armies. In the north, they face an alliance of 14 kings, and they defeat them too. They eliminate every city that they come to. No survivors, no prisoners. Now, many people ask, why would God have them completely eliminate those native people of the land? Well, we have to look at God's upper story and remember that God was preparing this perfect environment in which he could dwell among his people. God was not so much giving the land to the Israelites as he was taking it away from the Amorites. Moses had told the people after they had received the 10 Commandments, it's not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you're going to take possession of their land, but on account of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God will drive them out before you to accomplish what he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This land that God had chosen for his people was being desecrated by the wickedness of its inhabitants. What seems brutal and excessive in our lower story is a statement about God's justice and righteousness. God is patient. God is long-suffering. He had given the Amorite people more than 600 years to change their ways. God could not tolerate the widespread evil that had infected the entire Amorite nation. They worshiped other gods, and they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burned their sons and their daughters as a sacrifice to their gods. Something had to be done. God's upper story message is clear. The environment and community that God envisioned for his people, in which he will come and reside with them, cannot tolerate evil. By establishing his name in Canaan, everyone would know the one true God. Through Israel, others would be drawn to God, who wants to be intimately involved with his people. God continues to call each of us to be the same kind of unique people who will attract others to him. We are called to live distinctive, wholesome lives that stand out from lives characterized by selfishness, greed, materialism. God's calling us to face the giants in ways that reflect our trust in him. He's calling us to choose life, to value those whom society rejects. Excuse me. To counter hatred and prejudice with love for all of God's people. Just like those Israelites, we'll need to be brave and courageous if we are to live as God calls us to live. We'll need to become people of the Word so that we know God's ways and we can follow his guidelines so we can get along with one another and with God. Whenever we have that inner sense that he is calling us to do something difficult for him, we should do it so that others may see the one true God. In the lower story, the giants are bigger than the Israelites. In the upper story, God is bigger than the giants. We all face battles in our lives. Like Joshua, we need to be faithful people. There is more unfolding in the story than we will ever be able to see. And if we look intently into the Word, we will discover that God's will is and how we are to proceed. We will find courage and strength. We need to be a people of prayer, asking God if we should move forward or hold our ground. Listen for God. We should be a people who are identified with God. If we are in a relationship with God and his Son Jesus, we need to be publicly proclaiming our allegiance. We need to live our lives obediently so that others will be drawn to our God. Just as Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, God knows that we'll fight our own battles. We can be reassured that he is in charge and he will fulfill his promise of, I will be with